gentlemen seen your midterm grades yet?
Oh, they're not posted yet, sir.
2 C's, 2 D's, and an F. That's a 1.2 grade average. Fat, drunk, and stupid is no way to go through life, son.
This is WICR.
From the basement of La Pensa, this is The Rock is on this cold, chilly October 27th, 2016, Thursday. We have a lot to get to today. World Series began, NBA season started, and we got some big headlines from both the local football teams and the Jets and Giants. But let's dive right into the World Series. Now, I told you folks last week that if it was Indians-Dodgers in the World Series, I said that Indians were going to win the World Series. They were going to win the whole thing. But if it was Indians-Cubs in the World Series, I said it's a flip of a coin. Both teams are similar in many ways, numerous ways. You know, they both have great starting pitching. They both have great bullpens. Both have a core group of guys in their lineup that can swing the bat and be productive not only at the plate, but in the field in their defense. And they both have two great managers, in Terry Francona and Joe Maddon, respectively. You know, in Game 1, the Indians won 6-0, but it was Corey Kluber and John Lester. And in that game, Kluber was just phenomenal. You know, he had 9 strikeouts, pitched 6 innings, only gave up 4 hits, no walks, and he brought his A game and set the tone for the Indians in Game 1. You can't really say that for Lester. Now, he didn't get rocked. John Lester didn't get rocked, but he just didn't have it in Game 1. You know, he only pitched 5 2/3 innings, gave up 3 runs, surrendered 3 walks, had 7 strikeouts, but gave up 6 hits during the process as well. And but there's one thing that stood out to me in Game 1 of the World Series, and that was Andrew Miller. Now look, we all know Andrew Miller is a major asset to this Indian ball club, and he's pretty much a key reason why they're in the World Series in the first place. But he did one thing, though, that really stood out to me, and it separates the good pitchers from the great pitchers. Whether you're a relief pitcher or starting pitcher, what he did was, even though he didn't have his A game, because the Cubs and credit to the Cubs though, because they were making him work and throwing a lot of extra pitches though, and they weren't fooled by any off-speed stuff. He found a way to pitch out of jams, even when his stuff wasn't working, or his A game. He didn't have his A game that day. And it just shows, and Andrew Miller is the definition of clutch, without a doubt in my mind. He is the definition of clutch. You go in a dictionary and you look up the word clutch, you'll see a picture of Andrew Miller. Because this guy is just lights out. I wouldn't say lights out, okay. Lights out, good, tough, mentally, you know. Because he got out of 2 jams late in the game. In the 7th inning, he struck out Addison Russell and David Ross with the bases loaded. And then another jam when it was runners on first and second, and the game was still in reach for the Cubs. It was only 3-0 up into the bottom of the 8th, or to the top of the 9th. He struck out Kyle Schwarber to end the top of the 8th with runners on first and second. And he threw 46 pitches, and Terry Francona worked him. He pushed him. But you know what? You have to do what you have to do. This is the World Series. You can't leave any stones unturned. And kudos to Tito for pushing all the right buttons this whole postseason and in the World Series for Game 1. Also in the game, and you know, with Miller pitching 46 pitches, or throwing 46 pitches though, you kind of wondered, all right, if the Cubs lose Game 1, they don't have to face Miller in Game 2. So it's kind of a win-lose if you want to look at it from a Cubs fan or from the Cubs perspective. Also, in Game 1, we saw the emergence of the catcher Roberto Perez, who hit 2 home runs. He had a solo home run in the second, third inning, Solo shot in the second, third inning, and then he had a 3-run homer off Anthony Rendon in the 8th inning to blow the game out of reach for the Cubs and secure a victory for the Indians. So he kind of made his case for the MVP early, but, made a case. Now we move over and we move to Game 2. And I said to myself, I was thinking, if the Cubs lose this game, and they have Jake Arrieta pitching, and he was facing against Trevor Bauer, and I said to myself, if the Cubs lose this game and go down 0-2, even though they're going back to Wrigley Field, I do not see them winning this series. No way. Absolutely not. And you know what? Credit Joe Madden and the Cubs offense for turning the switch and pretty much redeeming themselves. Because right from the start, if you saw Game 2, the Cubs were much more aggressive at the plate. Anthony Rizzo had the RBI double. That set the tone for the Cubs in Game 2. And Jake Arrieta knew he had to pitch a good game, had to give the Cubs a victory just to have a chance in this series. Was lights out, and had a no-hitter going, believe it or not. He pitched 5 2/3 innings, allowed 1 run, 2 hits, 6 strikeouts, and only 3 walks. So he gave the Cubs an opportunity to win the game, and they won the game by a score of 5-1. And also, Kyle Schwarber got back into the mix. He had 2 hits and 2 RBIs. And for a guy that only had 5 plate appearances the whole year, because we all know Schwarber got hurt way early in the season, or when the season started, had a torn ACL, had to work his way up, was in the Arizona Fall League a few days ago, now is playing on the grand stage of baseball, which is the World Series. So he's back. And one thing about the Cubs, their bats, their offense has been pretty stagnant through this postseason. I know they had that good game in LA when they played the Dodgers and in Game 4 where they scored 10 runs. But, for the most part, this Cubs lineup has been pretty stagnant, to say the least. They don't score that many runs, but they scored a lot of runs in Game 2 of this series. Well, not a lot of runs, but it seemed like they scored a lot, though, because they scored it early in the game. And shifting towards the Indians now, it kind of makes you think. The Indians, and I realize this, I'm sure a lot of people do, the Indians cannot rely heavily or cannot just rely on Corey Kluber and their bullpen. Their other starting pitchers have to step up and get the job done as well. Trevor Bauer was ineffective. I know he has the stitch. He's coming off, he had stitches on his right pinky, though, and I remember in Game 3, he was bleeding profusely, though, and he had to get taken out. It was only the first inning. But, he's got to step it up. And, and the other starters have to step up as well. Because if the Indians really think they can rely on Corey Kluber to win this series for them and their bullpen, it's not going to work, folks. It's certainly not going to work. Because doing that's kind of like reminiscent. It's kind of similar to what the Phillies did in 2009 with Cliff Lee. You remember, and if you're a Yankee fan, you will remember when you played the Phillies and you won that series. The 2 games that the Phillies won is when Cliff Lee pitched, and he was just phenomenal. Flat out phenomenal. The guy had his pitches. He was throwing effective pitches, though, pounding the zone for strikes. Yankees couldn't hit him. And I think that's what happened with the Phillies. They were too reliant on Cliff Lee to win them the series, and they wind up losing in 6. And I think the Indians, to an extent, are doing that with Kluber, but they can't do that. They can't. The other starting pitchers have to step up. It's imperative for them. And with that being said, for Game 3 in Wrigley Field tomorrow night, 8:08 first pitch start, it's Josh Tomlin and Kyle Hendricks. Josh Tomlin for the Cubs and Kyle Hendricks for Josh Tomlin for the Indians, and Kyle Hendricks for the Cubs. And that's going to be a pivotal Game 3. Because I read somewhere that when the World Series was tied 1-1, the winner of Game 3 winded up winning the World Series. Whoever won Game 3 won the World Series 68% of the time. It was something like that. And also, referring back to Game 1, go back to Game 1 a little. The winner of they said on Fox, the winner of the last 12, 12 of the last 13 teams that won Game 1 wind up winning the World Series. Now, it has no effect on this series, but it's just something to keep in mind. Now, going back to Game 2. Like I said, winner of Game 3 when the World Series tied 1-1 would wind up winning the World Series 68% of the time. Or 68% of the time, that team that won Game 3 when the series was tied 1-1 wind up winning the World Series. You know, it's not going to have an impact. It may not have an impact on this series, but it's just another side note, something to keep in mind. And which leads, depending on what happens in Game 3, and this piqued my curiosity. I want to know what's going to happen, or what is Terry Francona going to do for his Game 4 starter. He hasn't made a decision yet, because for the Cubs, it's John Lackey. But if the Indians win Game 3, do they pitch Corey Kluber for Game 4? And then if it goes to a 7th game, you have him ready for a 7th game. Or do you put Danny Salazar in for Game 4 and then have Kluber pitch Game 5? A lot of ifs, a lot of what to do's and all. But if I were, now I'm not gonna, how can I say, discredit Terry or Tito, because like I said, he's been pushing the right buttons this whole year, this whole postseason. I think he has tremendous confidence in his guys that they can get the job done and that their arms feel good and whatnot, and they can stay consistent. But I think if the Indians do go down 2-1, Kluber will pitch Game 4 for them. But if they're up 2-1 and they win Game 3, then I think, you know what? Maybe you put Danny Salazar there. And he pitched Game 2 though. He pitched an inning of Game 2 though. It was his first pitch. First time he was pitching since September 9th. So because he had I believe it was an elbow injury, something with his elbow. Yeah, it was an elbow injury. So he threw a pitch and then somebody hit the ball. Somebody hit the ball, and the ball hit off his elbow. So he was out for a while. For a little while. But that's going to be a key question going into Game 4 after Game 3. Will Corey Kluber pitch Game 4? Because you're going to have John Lester pitch Game 5 unless, Joe Madden wants to move him up a day for Game 4. A lot of what ifs. But, it should be an interesting series the rest of the way. And it's gonna be really fascinating to see what Terry Francona does in that game. And that concludes this first segment of The Rock is On.